and respect each other, differences of opinions and differences of religious opinions and religious practices, and build Syria to be a true democracy and a prosperous country. I also hope that we don't forget, or that this actually is an opportunity to remember the plight of political prisoners everywhere in the Arab world, although Syria is probably worse, but there are political prisoners in every Arab country, from Morocco to Bahrain, from Syria to Sudan and Libya and Mauritania. We need to really work together to free all political prisoners across the Arab world. It's enough, this persecution of political opponents of the regimes has to end. We have to put an end to these gross violations of human rights across the Arab world. So today we have 3 or 4 lawyers who are joining us from Tunisia, and a couple of activists and also a lawyer from outside Tunisia. And we are happy to have them and to talk about what is happening in Tunisia. Tunisia used to be the model only 3 years ago, not too long ago, was considered to be a successful model for democracy, not a perfect model, not a perfect democracy, but a successful transition, a successful model for democracy in the Arab world. For 10 years, Tunisia has achieved a lot, and especially in the field of human rights and freedom of expression and free and fair elections and so on. Unfortunately, now only 3 years after the coup of July 25, Tunisia has become one of the worst regimes in the Arab world in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of freedom of organization, independence of the courts, of the judicial system, independence of the media. Tunisia has gone from the best in the Arab world probably to the worst, or very close to the worst in the Arab world. So how did that happen? Why did it happen? That is a big question, but today we really want to emphasize or talk about the plight and the updates about certain political prisoners, what is happening to them, and we will use that as a model or as an example to understand what is really happening in Tunisia. So many of the speakers will speak in Arabic, but there is interpretation available. So if you don't speak Arabic or don't understand Arabic, please click on the bottom button at the lower bottom of the screen where it says interpretation, and you can choose either the Arabic or English to listen to the interpretation in English. So with that, each speaker will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and hopefully we will have 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you and to introduce Mr. Abdelrazak Al-Kilani. He is a lawyer. He was the dean of the Law Association, the Lawyers Association in Tunisia. And he was a minister in Tunisia after the revolution. He was also ambassador of Tunisia to the United Nations in Geneva. So he is one of the most active human rights lawyers in Tunisia. So we welcome Mr. Abdelrazak Al-Kilani. Mr. Abdelrazak, if you can give us a brief introduction about what's happening in Tunisia today, please.
Thank you, Dr. Radwan. I greet your guests and all the participants in this webinar. I would like to thank you for this initiative, this good initiative, which is in reality, which reminds us that it's not only in Syria. In Tunisia also there are political prisoners. And we are all overjoyed with what is happening and what has happened in Syria. I hope the transition to democracy happens smoothly and successfully in Syria. We all know that Tunisia lived through a democratic transition after the revolution of 14th of January 2011. And this phase, this transition, we know that the Tunisian people witnessed free and fair elections, and they experienced freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. Then we had the setback on the 25th of July 2021. You know that the elected president, Qais Said, who was elected thanks to the revolution and the gains of the revolution, the elected president himself undertook a coup against institutions and against the constitution and set himself up since that date, set an authoritarian system resulting in violations of freedoms. And today we are here to talk about political prisoners who are in prisons, and also Tunisians who are prosecuted for their ideas and their opinions and their political practices. To set the context for this event, we lived through presidential elections on the 6th of October 2024, which were a disgrace and witnessed grave violations. These elections that were boycotted by 94% of young Tunisians, and only 27% of voters took part. And we know that the current president, according to his own official figures, achieved 90% of votes. Of course, these elections, there were preparations for these elections because it was not possible for a dictator to win elections without repression, without restricting freedoms and persecuting his political opponents. And he set the ground for these elections by placing his rivals in these elections. He put some of them in prison and opened judicial investigations against others. And to keep this brief, he prosecuted 13 presidential candidates. Some of them are still in prison, the most important of whom and whose case is concerning. It's the case of Ayesh Zemel, whose candidacy was accepted by the Election Commission and was included on the list of candidates. He has been in prison since the 6th of September, 1 month before the elections, and hence he was not able to hold an election campaign. And we all know that he achieved 7% of official vote, but in return, he has been subjected to 35 cases for alleged falsification of electoral endorsements, and he was sentenced to over 35 years in prison. So these political prisoners, this is the first one that we must draw attention to. So he was an engineer, a chemical engineer, and a businessman and a former member of parliament. Hence, it was surprising to see him stand as a candidate, which cost him his freedom. Also, the case of Abir Moussi, who is a lawyer and the president of a party, who has been in prison since 6th of October 2023 because of the application of Article 54, the infamous article related to the spreading of fake news and defamation. She has several cases against her, and she has been sentenced to prison, and she is still in prison. Also, Lotfi Mraihi, who who is a doctor who was imprisoned before the election, 4 or 5 months before the elections. As for the other candidates, such as Abd Latif al-Makki, Mundar Znaidi, Imad Daimi, Murad al-Masoudi, Nizar al-Shari, all of these, Safi Said, also, they are being tried. Some are abroad, some are in Tunisia. They are threatened at any moment to be imprisoned. So this situation, to diagnose the current situation just before the elections and after the elections. So this period before the elections, we witnessed grave violations of freedom of expression and freedom of opinion and freedom of demonstration, and we witnessed several arrests of journalists and commentators and lawyers based on the infamous Decree 54 related to the publishing of fake news and defamation on social media. Also, these detentions included several politicians from various parties and also former members of parliament. There are 123 members of parliament who are being interrogated for conspiring against the state, for holding an online plenary to repeal the coup, and now they are being accused of conspiracy against the state. We have former presidents such as Hamad Jbali, Ali Al-Arayeb. Ali Al-Arayeb is in prison. Also, former Prime Minister Mahdi Boujum'a, and the former head of government who is abroad. They are being prosecuted. And also a former president, Dr. Munsif al-Marzouqi, he is also being prosecuted in several cases for conspiracy against the state, and also on the basis of the anti-terrorism law. And also the Speaker of Parliament, Rashid Ghannouchi, who has been in prison for almost 2 years, and he is 83 years old, for giving a political speech, a peaceful speech without calling for violence or extremism. So also these detentions and prosecutions have also included heads of civil society organizations such as iWatch, Muraqibun, election observers, for politically motivated charges, including receiving suspicious funds from foreign sources. Most of these were critical of the government. None of this would have happened had there been an independent judicial system that is not under the control of the president. Unfortunately, today, the situation of the judiciary is very dangerous as a result of the violations that undermine its independence and the basic foundations, such as the supremacy of the law and separation of powers. And today, the executive interferes in the judiciary and harasses and pressurizes lawyers and judges almost on a daily basis. And you know that there have been dismissals and imprisonment and prosecution of several judges, and hence the right to a fair trial and trust in the judiciary are almost completely inexistent. Today also, the situation is getting worse in the absence of the Supreme Judicial Council, which we all know was dissolved, and also the temporary council that was imposed and appointed by the president is not functioning. Hence, the judiciary is being run by the justice minister based on decrees. So the dismissal of judges and appointment of judges is being done by the justice minister in contravention of all international standards in relation to the independence of the judiciary. And we all know that the African Court on the 3rd of October in 2024 ruled on the on Decree 53, presidential decree, on the basis of which the Supreme Judicial Council was dissolved, and Decree 516, on the basis of which Qais dismissed 57 judges without providing them any of their due rights. So the African Court on People's Rights and Human Rights ruled that these actions against judges constitute a dangerous threat, and ruled that these judges should be reinstated within 35 days. So it gave the government 15 days to execute this ruling, but the authorities unfortunately have not abided by this binding ruling. Also, I would like to discuss the situation of another political prisoner, Mr. Noureddin Bhiri, former Justice Minister, former Member of Parliament, lawyer, and one of the leading members of another party. On the 19th of October 2024, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, 20 years in prison, for the charge of threatening the nature of the state on the basis of a non-existent Facebook post alleging that the post was inciting people to rebellion. Although the interrogation judge appointed an expert to find this post, which was never found. What draws our attention is that Mr. Noureddin Bhiri, when he was arrested, was subjected to severe violence, which caused the breaking of his shoulder, leading to an operation. And he was sentenced despite the fact that the Anti-Torture National Commission, which is an official state commission, it confirmed that Noureddin Bhiri was subjected to violent acts by the security forces and the interrogation judge, who refused to allow him to be examined by doctors, although he could see the traces of torture and violence against Noureddin Bhiri. And the Anti-Torture Commission confirmed that what Noureddin Bhiri was subjected to constitutes inhumane treatments and a violation of the Anti-Torture Commission and the Tunisian Penal Code. Despite this report, and despite the lawyer's requests to the court to postpone the trial, to examine the complaints they submitted for torture after the torture he had been subjected to during his detention. So in the first hearing, the court accepted the postponement, and in its second hearing, it repealed its former decision. And although lawyers insisted on their rights, because a complaint for torture is important and has consequences for the process, but the court refused, and the prosecutor refused, to open an investigation into these torture allegations, despite the existence of this report and letters by the lawyers to the president and the justice minister holding them responsible. But to this day, there has been no investigation into what Noureddin Bhiri was subjected to. So this is a sample which I believe confirms that today torture is back to Tunisia. Unfortunately, after we had believed that this black page in our history had been turned forever, although we had undertaken the process of transitional justice in a similar way to South Africa. We set a law for transitional justice and the Truth and Dignity Commission, which managed the process, the transitional justice process. Unfortunately, today we find that the president of the Truth and Dignity Commission, Mrs. Siham bin Sedrine, since the 1st of August 2024, has been in prison for a laughable charge of falsifying the final report of the commission. So the report that she herself had written, she is accused of falsifying it. So today, the situation is dangerous. After the great steps taken in all domains, all the progress, we had witnessed elections in 2011, 2014, 2019. Unfortunately, since the 25th of July, 2021, all of that is part of the past, and very sadly, it is impossible for us to remain silent in the face of such a situation, particularly in view of the continuation of political trials and detentions, which have not stopped. There are almost daily prosecutions of activists on social media. If you write a post that is critical on social media, you are prosecuted on the basis of the infamous Decree 54 related to publishing fake news and what is called fake news. And therefore, it's necessary to stand. We all know that Tunisia has ratified all international treaties related to civil rights and political rights. So Tunisia is bound by these and required to respect them. There are decisions issued by the African Court on Human Rights and People's Rights, which Tunisia was a founding member of, and this court has ruled that what happened on the 25th of July is a coup against institutions. And to this day, despite the court's binding decision, which orders the authorities to return to constitutional legitimacy, this order has not been executed. And similarly with the decision issued on 14th of October, which exposed the practices against the judiciary. So thank you. And now we move to Mrs. Ines Harrak, who is a lawyer and human rights activist in Tunisia. Please go ahead. Thank you. Thank you also for the time chosen for this meeting to talk about something to talk about violations resulting from dictatorship, because they are too deep usually and we usually find out after the fall of authoritarianism, like has happened in Syria. But I can talk to you about people who have not received medical care in prison, including one of my clients, whose limbs were amputated. So this is not only concerning what happens to political prisoners, but the state violates human dignity against all prisoners. There are no rights, there is no hygiene, there are no visits by children, there is no possibility of practicing any activities that preserve human dignity. So the situation of political prisoners explains what the authorities want to achieve. Who have been targeted? It's those who used to play different roles in the political scene. So those who the regime decided to target are institutions and the possibility of continuing political life. So first he targeted the Assembly and the Supreme Judicial Council to undermine the separation of powers. And then after prosecuting all members of parliament and banning them from traveling, including members of the Karama coalition, including former MP Yasin Ayari. And now judges are the targets. Why? Because just as Mr. Kilani said, they would have stood against. So anyone who did not submit to orders of the executive were dismissed or imprisoned. For instance, the situation of Hattab bin Uthman, a trade unionist from the court union, he was accused of hiding a report, and when that was proven to be wrong, he was rearrested on the same day. He was released at 9 p.m. and at 4 a.m. the next day he was rearrested, and the interrogation judge who had released him found that his office had been sealed and he was dismissed from work. And the aim is to establish fear. I have seen how the judge who issued 7 prison orders against well-known political activists like Jawhar bin Mbarak, Shayma Isa, Aysam al-Shabi. I saw how that judge was crying after issuing prison orders against these opponents. He was not convinced, he was not happy. He was crying. Investigation judges at the anti-terrorism pole, after issuing those prison orders, they live in a constant state of fear and anxiety. And even after executing those orders, they are still moved to other areas, and other judges are brought to those positions to play the same role. So what has happened gradually is that those who played any role during the 10 years of freedom, as an official, as a politician, as an activist, as a member of parliament, anyone who was a hero of the anti-terror struggle, such as Judge Bashir al-Akarmi, anyone who was part of the narrative of democratic success, of the establishment of a democracy in the third world and the Arab world, have become targets, because the target is the institutions and the narrative itself, the possibility of achieving a successful model. That was the target. After that, just before the elections, repression increased to exclude all serious rivals. When the elections came, there was no serious competitor. Journalists, since the arrest of individuals who were not prominent opponents, but like Burhan Sayis, Murad Zridi, commentators, and when they were arrested, everyone else got the message that there is no possibility of freedom of expression. All institutions have become devoid of any role or meaning. We have now the anti-terror laws that allow the pre-trial detention period to 15 days, that is now applied to political detainees. So, which would allow the fabrication of any charges during that period. So this is what happened, for instance, against Mr. Dr. Mundarunisi. He was arrested because on social media there was a recording attributed to him discussing between him and journalist Shahrazad Akesha, discussing internal matters of another party. What is the relationship between such a recording and terrorism? There is no violence, there are no jihadi groups, there are no weapons. This is a doctor known in his medical field who is teaching medicine at university and who had a role in a legal party, and a journalist who is not known for extremism. What is the relationship between terrorism and this case? For this case to be considered an anti-terror case, he was arrested in a humiliating way by the anti-terrorism unit, and his phone was searched to find any basis for a charge. When they did not find anything, they accused him of communicating with foreign bodies. And then to expand the case, they added other activists from Ennahda inside Tunisia and outside Tunisia. And when the investigation was concluded, they considered that not given information about that journalist and those activists can be considered a refusal to report a terrorist crime, which is nonsense. But when this is repeated, it leads us to a question. So the anti-terrorism unit and system, which has left its original role and is chasing political prisoners and opponents, does it have any time to play its real role of combating terrorism? These anti-terrorism units are now devoted, based on orders by the president, to chase those who disagree with the decisions of Qais Said. This is not an exception. All cases at the anti-terrorism poll are related to political opponents. Bloggers also, who are being accused of terrorism for writing critical things related to the elections, related to the regime or Qais Said, and they had not done anything that could be described as terrorism. If you notice, anyone who led another party in the last 3 years has been arrested and tried for terrorism, although they had taken part in power, they had taken part in elections. It's a party that gave up power. Rashid Ghannouchi is being prosecuted for several cases. One of them is terrorism, based on his speech. Also, Mundarunisi, who took over as president of the party, is detained for terrorism. Also, the Secretary General, who took over from Mundarunisi after his arrest, he himself is also being accused of terrorism and imprisoned after attending a public protest of the National Salvation Front related to supporting political prisoners. And he was detained on his way in his car with another activist of another party who is being accused of not attending a summons by the interrogation judge in a case that was already concluded. So the case of Mundarunisi was supposed to include Mohamed Ghannouchi, a member of another party, that investigation was sealed and concluded, and he did not receive the summons. Then when that member was in the same car as the former Secretary General of another party, Ajmi Lurimi, the two of them who were on their way back from a protest of the National Salvation Front, the two were arrested. So we see that whenever anyone tries to play a political role, even publicly and legally, they find themselves in prison. Anyone who stood in the elections find themselves in prison. Anyone who tries to criticize the authorities finds themselves in prison. So as a result, we find the desertification of political life, and all prisons have been filled, and now we see the need to build new prisons. The restrictions we see currently against lawyers are unprecedented. We cannot visit our clients freely. We cannot be given a permit to visit more than one political prisoner at a time. If I visit Jawhar bin Barak, I cannot visit Jawhar bin Barak or Rashid Ghanouchi at the same time, although they are in the same prison. There are restrictions in all the cases of political prisoners. We were banned from attending in the first 48 hours after the detention, although that is an exception that is related only to terrorism cases. In all the cases related to political prisoners, political activists, their homes were searched, all books and documents were seized, all electronics, without any justification. We have seen children's books who were seized, things related to children or spouses, PhD theses, without any justification. Everything is seized. People were all banned from traveling without any justification. When an activist is detained, he has no rights, and the same for his family and his belongings and his bank accounts and his past, present, and future. Anything can be done. We are in a country without institutions, without a judiciary, without immunity for anyone. Recently, there was Judge Hamad al-Rahmani, who was summoned by the judge, and he pleaded judicial immunity, and now he is in prison. So we are currently, as lawyers, when we ask for the implementation of the lawyers' charter, that we should not be arrested, but should be heard by the interrogation judge, which is we are arrested and we remain 48 hours at the initial judge. And this is also what happened to Nuruddin al-Bahiri, whose shoulder was broken at the time. So we are in a situation where there is no meaning to the penal code, no meaning to the press code, no meaning to the lawyers' charter. And you know what happened to the constitution? It was thrown away and a new constitution was written, and it's imposed on us. There is no law in Tunisia, and what is coming is worse, because political life, civil society life, trade union life, everything is over. We are in a situation where we are just waiting for God's mercy. Political prisoners who have had sentences issued, like yesterday, there was a sentence against Hattabi bin Uthman, a unionist, for his criticism of the authorities and his support for political prisoners. Sentenced to 14 years are based on an empty case file. No political prisoner has been released out of all those who were targeted in relation to roles they played during the decades of freedom, because the narrative of the coup, to justify their actions, they need to say that these were criminals. So we know this will apply to the sentences against Rashid Ghannouchi, Adil Arayed, Nuruddin Bhidi, and any officials. We expect very heavy sentences. We expect the worst against Judge Bashir al-Akrami, because he is the judge who secured the narrative, the true narrative in relation to the terrorist cases that happened in Sousse, in Bardo, in the assassination cases. This judge has to be implicated. So we expect the worst, and we expect that the few people who are still telling the truth in relation to what is happening in Tunisia, they will be silenced. And what we can ask you as people who support freedom, not to stop talking. At one point, Tunisia will turn into a large-scale prison, and we will all be within it, most likely. And those outside prisons will not find anyone to listen, but to convey. Thank you, Mr. Inez, for this appeal and this diagnosis of the situation in Tunisia. We hope that God will deliver all political prisoners and liberate them and bring them back to their families and to their former activism in politics, which is the right of every citizen. Now we move to Mr. Aziz Al-Akrami, the son of Judge Bashir Al-Akrami, mentioned by Mrs. Inez, who is a prominent judge in Tunisia, well known for his fairness and independence, and who played his role in investigating the charges regarding another party. He is not related to another party, and he was never accused of that, but he played his role, and he found himself in prison. Sorry, in your introduction of Bashir Al-Akrami, he was in charge of the two most dangerous terrorism cases in Tunisia and beyond, that of the terrorism attack of the Bardo Museum and the attack of the Sousse beach, two very serious cases, and he was awarded and recognized by Scotland Yard, because there were many foreign victims of those terrorist attacks, and he was recognized. His work was commended and recognized. He is very well known, and we hope to hear more from his son Aziz.
Which basically proves how this whole arrest from the start was politically motivated. I'd like to say that the cases against my father currently and the arrest warrants against him have zero evidence. And, it's easy to say that, but I will start by simply talking about the cases. These three cases and these three arrest warrants are as goes. The first case has to do with him failing to report weapons in connection to the assassination of Shukri Bil-Aid on the 6th of February 2023. This failure to report weapons, which was in their possession, was in 2016, in a time where my father was no longer responsible for this case, in a time where he was already a public prosecutor, and there was another judge responsible for the case, which basically means that it's not in his responsibility to report anything. It's a responsibility of his new judge. The second case has to do with him failing to prosecute two suspects in relation to the Shukri Bil-Aid case. Again, I would like to point out that all of these cases are based on his judicial decisions. And every single judicial decision was approved by the judicial circle, which provides oversight for any judge. Basically, if he's in prison for these decisions, he should also be chilling in prison with 5 or 6 other members of the judicial circle. Yet they're not currently in prison. This entire contradictory line of attack and line of prosecution in Tunisia makes absolutely no sense. You have a decision, an oversight, you have a judicial circle which signs off and monitors your decision so that your decision would not be potentially corrupt or potentially, wrong. And sometimes you have a wrong judgment. Yet the judicial circle kept signing off on these decisions, and these are its members are high-ranking judges. Yet only Bashir Aqabi is the person who's today in jail. Let me keep going. The second case, like I said, is failure to prosecute two suspects. And the reason these suspects weren't prosecuted is because there is another case against them with the same exact charges, terrorism charges. The case of them killing military officers. So a judge cannot simply prosecute someone for a case where there's another case with the same charge against them with another judge. So he simply referred them to the other judge. It's a completely normal legal procedure, yet today there's an arrest warrant ongoing against him for this. Makes absolutely no sense. The third and last arrest warrant comes for him not arresting another individual. And again, it's the same idea. This was a judicial decision signed off on by the judicial circle, which not only is it judicial decisions in general by judges are protected by law, so that judges wouldn't be afraid to make their own judgments. That's the whole idea, that's the whole basis of the legal system. Today, my father lies in prison with barely any access to medical treatment. He's suffering immensely under horrible conditions that Mr. Kileni and Mrs. Haraf have spoken about. The conditions of prisoners in Tunisia are way worse than they were during the last 4 years. They have intensified their prosecution. They have intensified their torture. My father, as soon as he was arrested, was unfortunately targeted and tortured, just like Mr. Khiri. He was subjected to torture by the same police he prosecuted years ago for torture, which just speaks to the absolute ridiculousness of it all. Today, he lies in prison for absolute bogus charges. After fighting for 34 years to uphold the independence of the judiciary, there is no one piece of evidence linking him to any terrorist organization. There is nothing that can justify this terrorist treatment. Lawyers have barely any access to him. Medically, after his torture, he did not receive sufficient medical care. All of his plights were ignored. And today, he has been in prison as of today for 1 year and 9 months. Imagine this, you're a judge serving your country 34 years, and you're in prison for 1 year and 9 months without any actual prosecution, without any court order, without any conviction. It makes no sense. The minimum of human decency or even state decency is to wait so that the court actually issues a real judgment. But in his case, 1 year and 9 months, 1 year and 9 months is the same time you would spend for manslaughter. It's the same time a criminal would spend for distributing drugs. It's the same time you would spend for aggravated assault. This is a very serious time to be spending in prison, and let alone a Tunisian prison that sucks the life out of you, makes you sicker, kills you slowly and painfully. This is a horrible situation, and the Tunisian government is responsible for this crime. Not only should we fight against it, but we should speak out against the governments that are supporting the Tunisian government, and speak out against not only for my father, but for all political prisoners who are today countless people, nameless. So many people are even afraid to say that they have been politically imprisoned. Everyone is hoping for some sort of break. The situation in Tunisia is super bad, it's abysmal, and it's only getting worse by the minute. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. Unfortunately, we had two other speakers who were supposed to join us, Mr. Samir bin Amr and Mr. Abdul Raouf Al-Ayadi. Both of them are lawyers in Tunisia, but apparently they have not been able to join us yet. So we're going to go to Q&A, questions and answers. If you have any question that you'd like to ask to any of the panelists, you can do so either by typing it in the chat or in Q&A, or by raising your hand, and we will give you the mic and you can ask it verbally. So if there are any questions from our participants and attendees, you can ask your question in 3 different ways: by chat, by Q&A, or by raising your hand, and we give you the mic. So I see already we have one question. Mr. Muaz Zimni. مرحبا بك سي معز، تفضل عندك الكلمة.
شكرا مرحبا بكم السادة الحضور.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me?
شكرا أستاذ.
Thank you, Dr. Adwen. I wanted to say that this situation is only getting worse, and the dictator does not care what happened to political prisoners, and he will continue in his injustice. What can break this deadlock? I'd like to ask the lawyers, Ilani and Haraf, is there any way out? Are there any pressures? I do not understand. This dictator does not care if there's any change in Syria, there any dialogue, any process to take us out of this dangerous crisis. Are there any efforts to convince him to step aside, to put an end to the persecution of prisoners and others who are the victims?
In Tunisia.
ممكن.
It is possible.
المسألة أن الدول لا تعيش معزولة.
The issue is that states do not exist in isolation. Tunisia is living at the mercy of aid. It is bankrupt. It is being supported regularly by loans and aid, and the aid that it receives, which we welcome, it should be conditional. Therefore, reports of all international organizations and activists in human rights around the world can change many things because they exert pressure. Officials in Tunisia, when they ask for aid, they should be asked, is there any respect for the minimum standards of human rights, of political prisoners, of activists, of people banned from traveling, of lawyers? Is there any respect of the law? Is there respect of judicial procedures? There should not be aid given or knives to be bought, to be applied to Tunisians. I believe that there are people who, with conscience, who have been people are going around the world, going out to support Gaza. I hope they will not wait for us all to die to protest for us. In prison, people, their dignity is violated. People cannot find clean water. Someone like Sonia Dahmani, the famous, beautiful presenter and a lawyer as well, her sister has written a Facebook post that she is demoralized. She does not find clean water. She does not even have basic hygiene tools. And they are not treated as women or as human beings. We are asking for the minimum standard of respect and transparency in applying the laws. We want supervision. What is the United Nations doing if they do not even supervise human rights? We are doing what we can to convey what is happening inside prisons, to reveal, expose what is happening within courts. What can be done to change the situation in Tunisia?
Honestly, I would say that Mrs. Ignace kind of did a good basically her idea of that this government will only survive based on international help and based on give-outs, and that we should kind of monitor these give-outs and we should speak out against them is essentially one of the best ways to fight against it. The second way would be to try to incite some public awareness towards these issues. Tunisians care about a lot of things, but they mainly also care about their ability to spend and their ability to use their day-to-day currency. And today the Tunisian currency is slowly collapsing, unfortunately, because of this regime. It's collapsing because of ignorance, because a country led by an autocracy, a country led by one person and his opinions can never prosper. This dictator does not employ professionals. He does not use correct strategies. He only employs passion, and he only employs kind of this idea of us against them, this very simple yet very corrupt and outdated idea of there is this hidden enemy that we need to fight, and once we take care of this enemy, we can prosper. This is nothing new. Idi Amin Dada did it, Hitler did it, Mussolini did it. Anyone who has ever picked up a history book can tell that this can never end well. This is just a delay until the inevitable collapse. If anyone would like to take a look of how Tunisia's future looks like under this regime, he would only to look a bit to the right towards Egypt, which is basically living under the same conditions. They have an autocracy which only cares about itself, keeping itself in power, and it's slowly taking the Egyptian currency towards ends that have never been seen before. The Egyptian currency has dropped to 400% in the last 3 years. That's insane. It's unbelievable. So the Tunisian dinar, as it suffers, the Tunisian people will be made aware that this is all because of, it's not their choice because this dictatorship was forced upon them, but unfortunately a consequence of this dictator and this elected, unfortunately, president making a coup. I think spreading awareness about the Tunisian currency and about the economic solution is one of the key facts here. And of course, the young people of Tunisia, the young generation is vital in moving this, in moving the bar forward and fighting for their own freedom. Just like the previous generation fought for their own freedom, died for their own freedom, achieved freedom, and unfortunately this freedom was stolen away for it. It is up to this generation to realize how important it is to be able to say what you need to say when you want to say it, and to fight against the police, fight also against judges, to basically have the freedom to say whatever you want. Is such a valuable and important concept for a good society.
شكرا. Thank you, عزيز.
I would like to add, I mentioned earlier that Tunisia is part of the international community and it has ratified many international treaties, which is bound by the human rights covenant. There are also mechanisms, international mechanisms, United Nations mechanisms specialized in human rights. We should also seek help from those instruments. There's the African Court on Human and People's Rights, and we have cases there. And I give some examples. There are also organizations, international organizations specialized in human rights that issue reports and statements about violations happening in Tunisia, like Amnesty International or other organizations like Human Rights Watch. Therefore, we must move. Human rights activists and those concerned about human rights should act and exert pressure on the Tunisian authorities. There is also another instrument recognized in certain countries regarding violations of human rights, particularly torture, like Tunisia, which recognizes in its penal code 689, which recognizes the court's ability for universal jurisdiction in relation to human rights cases. So people can bring cases against officials who are implicated in human rights violations. So we must continue until the fall of this regime, which I believe is on its way to fall. There is one question, more or less the same. I would like to reply at the end of this webinar that the Syrian revolution, the success of the Syrian revolution in the last week is the greatest proof that these regimes are not stable and that they are the principal cause of creating extremism, for creating poverty, and creating despair and destroying their people and their nations, and the cause of immigration, legal or illegal migration. All these catastrophes we suffer from in the Arab world, the main cause is these authoritarian regimes that do not respect their people and who treat their people as their enemies, as enemies of the state, while the state exists to serve the people and to preserve the rights of citizens. I believe that the Syrian revolution will change things, and that people, including the Tunisian people, they should wake up and unite and to leave behind political differences, which are natural differences which exist in politics between all Tunisians, like in all other nations, like the US or France or other countries. But there is also common ground. There are common objectives to protect the country, preserve human rights, protect citizens' rights. We must unite for that end, and I call that in the coming phase that we should have active movement in not only in Tunisia but in the Arab world to liberate political prisoners. This should be a priority not only in Tunisia but around the Arab world. There should be a strong movement towards the liberation of all political prisoners, regardless of their affiliations. They should not be, in the 21st century, they should not be imprisoned for their opinions or their positions or the expression of their opinion through writing or other forms of expression. I think that we have an opportunity that we should use. We should move quickly towards liberating political prisoners, which will change the orientations of these countries, and we should move away from authoritarian regimes that have destroyed our countries and our nations, and build democratic systems that respect their people, the people of the region, and respect human rights. I believe that is possible. If it is possible in Syria, which had one of the most corrupt and brutal regimes in its repression and authoritarianism, then I believe it is possible in Tunisia, in Egypt, and other Arab countries. So we conclude this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. I hope that you have benefited from listening to these testimonies, which I believe were very valuable and gave a clear image of the violations that are taking place in Tunisia. Tunisia deserves better than this, much better, with its women and men who are striving for human rights and democracy for more than 50 years. Tunisia deserves much better than this, and God willing, and the Arab world as a whole will turn to the right democratic path and respecting human rights, and a state that serves its people rather than a state that places them in prison simply for expressing their opinions or for opposing the president or the regime. As long as the opposition is peaceful and within the law, they should not be punished for it. Thank you very much.